head to theblock.co/campus to get a 3-month free trial. Now, today's episode is about dark pools on Hyperliquid, a fairly new development, something that Silhouette is hoping to bring out. So, can you sort of explain what is Silhouette and what are dark pools?
Cool. Dark pools is a concept that comes from traditional finance. Typically, how trading happens in the traditional finance world is you've got your stock exchanges, the New York Stock Exchange, the London Stock Exchange, and these are really good anchoring points for price discovery and for the market to coordinate around. Now, they use different mechanisms in different types of markets, but most of the time they look like central order limit books, much to what you can see in like Coinbase and Kraken, now today Hyperliquid. And these types of trading mechanisms are really, really good for you to enter and exit markets for most of the use cases. One of the other interesting developments that happen when you kind of coordinate your trading on these mechanisms is that if everyone were to kind of do their trades on these mechanisms, you would end up kind of slipping the market if you were to trade in size, or you wanted to trade kind of OTC or use a different mechanisms. One where particularly that you would do it off book. This is where kind of these dark pools emerged in finance. Now, dark pools in finance is just simply kind of one firm trading with another firm, and that trade would not necessarily be disclosed in any way, shape, or form. So the details of the trade would not necessarily be open and transparent. And this gave kind of just like another venue for traders to trade. And one of the key features there was the privacy that it enabled. This is really an important development because in markets where price discovery, and typically in traditional market, price discovery was quite easy to find because the reporting standards made price discovery a concept that was fairly simple for most traders to get access to. These dark pools actually enhance the ability for more traders to trade. And so what we noticed is that with the addition of privacy being added to these traditional markets, we basically had more trade happen as a net result. Now, the transparency that we see in DeFi basically just gets a lot of that reporting and kind of just like access to the information around price discovery open to everyone to use. You basically just need an RPC provider, and you can read the state from any sort of chain, kind of at a very, very cheap, at very, very low costs. And so what we're looking at wanting to build is a different mechanism to enable some of these private trading components, not necessarily quite like in the definition of a dark pool in the traditional world, but bring some of those components into the DeFi space. And kind of a key component here on why we think this is super important is most of the traditional kind of institutions that are looking at coming on chain somewhat desire and demand some of these features.
Sure thing. So, how does Silhouette work? How does it keep transactions private?
Yeah. At the basis of what we're building on the tech stack side is some of the more traditional types of cryptography that get enabled in the world. Trusted execution environments have been around for ages. These are, your fingerprint scanner on your MacBook Pro. That uses a secure enclave to kind of keep data protected within a larger computer. So you can kind of think of it as this like protected computer within a larger computer. In addition to that, so that's where we can kind of run a lot of these like matching components to provide the privacy that we need. But then there is this other component that really kind of a lot of the ZK side of the world, FHE and MPC type technology stacks really come into play. So we can generate a proof from this trusted execution environment to tie into like the on-chain settlement. So from like a build-out perspective, Silhouette's 3 components. Traders submit their order. That's the one component to Silhouette. We use these secure enclaves to privately match trades and order flow. And then the last component is settlement, where we use ZK to ultimately settle on chain. And in our specific case, for our first kind of like rollout of our product, that'll kind of go into the Hyperliquid ecosystem.
Okay, so when you say you use the trusted execution environments, where is that where the trades actually take place? So it's sort of done offline, or at least on your sort of the company's hardware.
Yeah, so You can kind of think of a trading environment as this like execution engine where it basically kind of matches orders according to certain logic. So one logic can be the way that Uniswap does it. So Uniswap uses in Uniswap v3 they've got these limit order type concepts. Uniswap v2 had the curve. Hyperliquid has a central order limit book. So whatever that logic is, you can run that on basically any piece of hardware, and you can run it on a server. That's just like a centralized version of how this would work. You could also run it in one of these enclaves, which gives you a little bit more security guarantees around what the actual matching engine is doing.
Okay, so is it decentralized?
The decentralization, so in the world of decentralization, what does decentralization mean? It's like how many people can run the node that ultimately gets to consensus. Now, in Ethereum, I can spin up my node at home. I need 32 ETH, can kind of get that set up fairly simply, and now I'm part of this decentralized network. In some other chains, there's far less nodes, and that kind of, you could assume it's less decentralized. There's like Nakamoto coefficient is a good example of how decentralized a network is. And for our case, the way that you would kind of introduce decentralization is by having multiple of these execution environments running together. So if one went down, the network as a whole would not necessarily break down. So decentralization also is quite an important path that many teams kind of over-index on in the beginning that leads to some sort of stifling in the future. So we have a path to decentralization. That path will be kind of taken a little bit more cautiously from our perspective. So we'll have like a small subnet of these trusted execution environments running in the beginning. We'll figure out that, is this product something that, where does this product fit within the market? And, what are the key features that we would want to enable that users would use? And once that kind of starts generating a decent amount of value, the concept of decentralization then becomes a little bit easier for us to rationalize around. So, we're starting very centralized in the beginning with a few execution environments, and then slowly like increasing that over time when the value is kind of makes sense for these networks to actually become decentralized.
Okay, and then let's say if you have other people setting up these trusted execution environments, how do you know that what they're doing is according to the specific rules that you want to be in place? And then also, how do people know that your environment is subject to those rules?
Yeah, this is actually a key to why we chose execution environments. One of the so we achieve this by kind of like working through there's a couple layers to this. So the first layer that kind of makes the guarantees of what you're running within these execution environments is that even if I'm running the software, so Tim, you running one of our trusted execution environments, you can't access what's happening on the inside of that enclave. So even if you own the hardware and run the hardware, and then kind of like want to tamper with the system, you can't do that. So these are why these enclaves are super secure, and the access to them is very tightly controlled. The only thing that you can really do is just simply turn your system off, and now you're no longer part of the network. So that's kind of one of the areas that we're kind of working with some of these TE providers to kind of add some robustness there. The second one is, the code that runs inside of those execution environments can be open source. So we can say this is what the matching engine is going to do. We publish the code, we write the documentation around that, and then within the enclave, you can generate an execution proof that you can see what the code is going to do, it did what it did, and then you can generate a proof that that actually was executed correctly. And that's part of the way the settlement proofs that go on-chain come from. And so not only can we make sure that access to these execution environments is somewhat gated, we can also make sure that the code that's running within them is super secure. And then we can even create proofs to show the user, at the end of the day, what you said it should do, it actually did, and here's the verification of that.
Yeah. Okay, so if someone else sets up one of these environments, they don't build it themselves. You would give them the secure enclave. Is that right?
Yeah, so there are a couple trusted execution environment providers. I think the one that's most commonly used is AWS Nitro. So Amazon have their versions of it. Apple have enclaves running on every iPhone and every MacBook today. So this concept's actually quite well known. There are other few providers, and there are even Web3 specific providers. So the one that we're partnering with in the early days is Marlin. Marlin kind of take care of a lot of the infrastructure, and we tie into their network of TEs that can kind of like, be a part of this. Now in the future, let's say anyone wants to come, they've got their TEs, they know how to get that infrastructure set up and running. There will be a spec on what this needs to conform to. You'll then come to the network and say, I want to be a TE. You do the checks that this hardware and infrastructure does match that spec, and then you can provide your TE to that network.
All right. And then, so why did you choose Hyperliquid as a base for this platform? Like, why did you choose to build on it?
Yeah. So going back, every time a new cryptographic paradigm came out prior to, what we have today, the first thing developers developed was a dark pool. ZK, they built ZK dark pools. FHE, they built an FHE dark pool. MPC, you name it. There's hundreds of these implementations of how you can build privacy trading mechanisms. And by and large, most of them have failed for a couple reasons. One of them is that they typically have low liquidity, and liquidity normally kind of has alpha attached to it, and the privacy is there to protect the alpha, and so there's no liquidity, there's no alpha. And so traders typically haven't really just bootstrapped these markets relatively efficiently, because privacy in itself doesn't sell. Privacy sells only in the pursuit of protecting alpha. And so when we were looking at how we could implement our version of this, it was really more a go-to-market question as opposed to a technical question. And when you looked at how liquidity typically flowed, Hyperliquid was kind of growing as this nexus point for a large amount of traders. Pre their TGE, it was somewhat known by a couple traders, but not really as on the map as it is today. And so they grew a community quite organically. They also developed pretty much the standard of how DEXs will be deployed going forward. And when we looked at kind of a venue for where we could tie these dark pools into, it was very clear to us that we needed to tie into a really sufficiently kind of robust ecosystem, and that's where Hyperliquid came in. And so for us, the choice was more a case of we knew that just privacy, but for privacy's sake, was not going to be enough of a sufficient set of tools for traders to come organically to an isolated market, but instead bringing privacy to where a lot of alpha is already being generated by a lot of these traders that are trading organically. And so therefore, it made sense to build alongside a liquid venue as opposed to just simply an isolated privacy DEX.
Sure. And how bullish are you on Hyperliquid as a layer one ecosystem?
I think their track record kind of speaks for themselves. And there are a couple interesting components that are being developed that I'm personally excited by. So the first one I would kind of showcase is that they deployed an EVM. So you've got this fully expressive sidechain that you can build the rest of DeFi with. And we're seeing a bunch of projects come out there. You've got your standard DeFi lending market, you've got some swap markets, some aggregators that are going there. And so for most of the users, one of the areas that they will be able, or one of these app developers will tie into, who would want to leverage against whatever the assets they have, can tie into a lending market that then has the backstop of an entirely extremely well functioning L1 DEX. So the bootstrapping problem for the chain is kind of already solved, and these liquidity engines is what saves chains. Look at Uniswap for Ethereum, look at GMX for Arbitrum. That's kind of what generates most of the activity for these chains, and almost all of DeFi requires these liquidity engines. And then the secondary part that I think is kind of more exciting, and that's a little bit more future looking, is concepts like HIP3, where you can deploy your own perps markets that basically, with just a subset of requirements, I think you need to stake 1 million hype as a security mechanism. You can generate and create your own perps markets, kind of really owning the decentralization component of create your own markets. Now, the third part that I'm quite excited about as to like why this is going to be quite interesting is if you think about how most teams list their coins now, they typically go to to a Binance, they sell their souls to the devil. That deal's never in favor of the project and it's almost extractive. But you can't not have your token not launched on Binance because that component in itself is what gets a lot of people interested in your project and adds a lot of value to your token. With these kind of new developments happening in Hyperliquid, we're seeing teams actually not even consider the centralized exchange route and might go directly to these decentralized DEX routes and ultimately kind of have an alternative that the barrier to entry is far less. You still have extremely active markets that you can tie into, and so for most projects that are thinking about their token strategy, this is an extremely compelling case that I think will draw a lot more projects to the ecosystem than any other ecosystem out there.
All right. And then what were your thoughts on James Wynn trading in size in public?
Yeah, we got a really good amount of attention after that. And it really highlights the case of what some of the problems are for trading completely naked on chain. So when James kind of played his hand out in the market, it gathered a lot of attention, and you immediately had the responses that came either through the market forces that were that he perceived as moving against him, but even just the public sentiment and kind of the folks that were chatting on crypto Twitter around it. And in James's case, it might be the way that he wanted to play that set of trades, and I'm not going to really, I can't really speak to how much he knows or what he was trying to do there. But if you're a larger institution or you kind of want to not have that attention drawn to you, there is very little options that you have to kind of like build that type of position in a market that you'd want to have a position in a market without kind of tools like Silhouette. And so for us, it really like put a nail in the head in terms of like what the benefits we would provide to an ecosystem like Hyperliquid.
And is it rewarding to see CZ saying that we need dark pools?
Yeah, I think CZ's position for dark pools is actually clear. Like, Binance naturally have a dark pool type component to their business. They have an OTC desk, and there's kind of parts of the ecosystem that they work with. And so him jumping into the conversation also kind of like added a bit more wind to our sails. And so for us, it was just validation from a conversational, an open public conversation on what we've believed for the last 6 months.
And did you see that Andrew Tate accidentally revealed his DEX trading history because he doxed his wallet, but I don't think he realized people would see all of his sort of history of previous trades.
I didn't actually see that. Not surprised. Anything funny that came out of that?
Well, I guess I think the salient point was I assume if you had dark pools, that information would be able to be released, would it? Or does the
Yeah,
transaction information become public after time?
I think, yeah. So, blockchains will always be blockchains, and that information will always be public. So, I don't think the concept of what was in Andrew Tate's wallet or in James Wynn's wallet is necessarily going to change. It's a completely new ecosystem. But in terms of, if you think about what traders care about, from their perspective, the overall accumulation of their wallet is not necessarily something that they care too much about, especially in the blockchain context. But what they do care about is when trades are live and when they're in the market or in a specific position over a period of time. That time is not typically over years long period. Trades sometimes can be as short as a couple of minutes to maybe a week to a couple months long time frame. That's when that information is super sensitive to the trader, and that's what they would want to protect. And so for us, I think the concept of having traders' personal information be protected in a global but open and transparent market, I think is the unique differentiator where most of these privacy pools have been 100% private nothing, you can never see into them. It's complete darkness. Is somewhat different to our approach. We do believe that DeFi offers this, ability for people to verify the state of the market, but allowing a specific trader the tools to protect their position relative to the market is somewhat of a nuanced kind of difference that we're exploring.
Yeah. And what are the biggest challenges to building something like this?
Um, I think previously it was around the technology. So about 2 3 years ago, ZK was growing at a pace that today we've got like super fast proofs that are being generated out there. Um, a lot of the interest in these privacy technologies and like the research, developer experience, and ultimate performance of them kind of makes it now is kind of the perfect time to be launching some of these protocols in a way that the tech's matured to a point where it makes a lot of sense. Now, so the technical challenges have somewhat been solved. The next kind of component is really understanding what do traders actually care about? What do the users of kind of tools like what we would provide actually care about? I think there's the case is kind of obvious, but when you ask them, what do you care about when you want to protect your privacy? What levels of latency do you care about? There's a lot of minutia around that I think is somewhat like unexplored in the public sphere. Most folks that kind of work in the privacy space either care about full privacy, and most folks in the market space don't really know too much about the cryptography side to implement it in an efficient way. And there is this small overlap with teams like ourselves and a couple others that care about that intersection, and kind of building a product that really caters for that intersection for us is what we've kind of been spending the last 6 months deeply understanding. And it takes a lot of conversations, it takes a lot of research, and it takes a lot of security reviews to kind of make sure a system that you build out at the end of the day matches both user demand and ultimately the security requirements for working on chain today.
Yeah. And how do dark pools work with market makers? Like, is it possible for market makers to participate in them, or does it not really work?
Yeah, of course. So uh, each dark pool is constructed somewhat differently. I think there's very many ways that you could go about it. So it depends on how you'd implement it. If you've got a central order limit book running inside one of these enclaves, then yes, of course, you can have market makers participate. Some dark pool mechanisms use RFQ or a request for quote. So it's just a simple quote. You just know the details of what that quote would be, and a market maker can just simply say yes or no to that. And so it's very mechanism dependent. But most market makers are actually dark pools in themselves. Their OTC desks work in a very similar concept for the same somewhat economic need. So market makers for a long time have been the crypto equivalent of dark pools. There just hasn't been sort of like a marketplace coordination mechanism or product out there to allow multiple market makers and multiple users to start kind of aggregating some of these deal flows.
Okay. And what are your next steps for going live?
Next steps for going live. So the team's been doing our internal testing over the past couple weeks. We will be going through a process of kicking the tires, polishing some of the components, getting some very critical user feedback on what we can improve. Soon after that, the goal would naturally be to kind of extend that into a broader beta testing phase. That beta testing phase will be where we kind of go live within the Hyperliquid ecosystem on mainnet, and then post that it's just feature enhancements, performance improvements, and naturally kind of catering to the types of trades traders would want to place using mechanisms.
Okay. And when are you targeting a launch date?
Launch dates TBD. It's interesting from a Web3 perspective. It typically works in these waterfall mechanisms where you develop a whole bunch of code, you somewhat have the product at like near complete state, you ship it off to an auditor, they review it, and then you kind of publish your contracts, you stitch everything together and you launch it. That process typically takes quite a lot of time. Um, mainly just because the contracts need to be in somewhat of a finalized state. And so the approach that most teams take in Web 2 has typically been very iterative. Make the basic system work end to end and then bolt on features afterwards. For Web 3, it's somewhat a different process. So we're kind of in the final stages of finalizing our contracts, getting them security reviewed, and then once that process completes, security can be anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks to somewhere to 2 to 3 months. And it all depends on the complexity of the system and ultimately the feature set that you want to launch with.
Sure thing. And are you going to do like a points program or something?
It's interesting that the points meta has become so valuable in the space as an initial kind of user attraction. I think there is a case that we're definitely considering points and we're definitely considering incentive mechanisms in general. One of the natural benefits of kind of building these off-chain privacy matching engines is that you're not beholden to the same fee structure as a typical exchange. And so, we might be considering like straight up revenue streams as part of the benefit that we have. So, you're trading on Silhouette, you could get fee rebates, you could get kind of, any savings that you have as a function of your execution, that could be a benefit. And then also the points program. So, balancing how do we actually ultimately build out a compelling reason for users to use us over and above just privacy is something that we've been deeply discussing with some folks. So TBD on a points program. I find them very interesting as bootstrapping mechanisms, and for us, we just kind of want to be thoughtful on their application.
Cool. Do you think you'll do a token?
Token is the same thought pattern as points, and also same thought pattern under the decentralization component. What's the token for is quite a deep question that many teams, I think, didn't early on was a very easy, oh, we're decentralized, the protocol's governed by this token, and then they had the headache of managing the governance token when trying to implement new features and grow and kind of like develop their ecosystem. I think this is a little bit of an inhibitor at this point in time. I also think folks are kind of tired of these altcoin tokens launching, having very fractional adoption, very fractional like amount of time that they remain relevant, and so realistically, like, is this the right market to launch a token? I don't necessarily think so right now. And so when we're considering a token launch from our perspective, we again think through the incentives, think through why the token really matters, but also added to the fact that tokens are normally a decentralization force. So distributing your token to the community, what's the value of holding the token? I think Hyperliquid have done a really good example of why holding the Hype token is really valuable with their buyback mechanisms and their staking features. But that does not necessarily need to be copied by every single team within the Hyperliquid ecosystem. So for us, tokens are something that we'll probably also even consider after the product has launched and after there's initial user traction.
And what's your vision if Silhouette succeeds?
I think for me, a clear example, a clear metric that I kind of care about when thinking about the impact I want Silhouette to have is the sex to dex ratio. I kind of want to get those to feature parity so that dexes are trading as much, if not more, value than centralized exchanges. I think the value proposition for that, for just kind of like access to markets, makes so much more sense and pushes the frontier of DeFi a lot more. And then the mechanisms that we need to do to get there, like we need to have features like privacy being built out. So having Silhouette being a forcing function for that outcome, I think, is really, really important, and be an attraction for net new capital into the entire crypto ecosystem. So not only kind of then challenge how markets get developed within like the sex to dex side of the world, but have folks like on the traditional finance side kind of take a bit more interest in these the crypto market as an asset class and kind of build their own kind of mechanisms of bringing their capital into crypto, they'll naturally go through the centralized exchanges and custodians first. And so the gateway into that market is definitely through the custodians, but have really seamless native integrations with the current kind of folks that are managing institutional funds.
All right. Well, what an exciting vision. We'll see if it takes place. That's all we have for today. I want to thank Chandler for joining this episode. And as a reminder, our newsroom works tirelessly to get you accurate, informed crypto news. If you want to stay ahead, read the block. Thanks, and see you next time.